So who would like the next part of this exercise until we break for lunch, which got an hour and a half, good time, is if you've got a principle that you've been reading and you've been mulling over, how about just read it out, we'll call on you, read it out loud. Everybody can hear which principle you have. This is an open book quiz. So all we did was take these pages here, right, in the front, and we just cut out those principles. So you have all of them in your book. So and for the note takers and people like that, you may wish to follow along in your book if you're tracking notes and things like that. And then we'll banter about each of them, and we'll just kind of move through them. And again, by way of mindset for holding this, these principles, when Kendall and I go do a design, we get hired to do something, everything we look at a place is filtered through the principles are what, it's like the checklist. That's what keeps us on our game. It's how we query the site and make sure we're not forgetting something, or we're blinded to something, or we're spacing out. This list of principles is your best friend as a designer. Because they're really your ability to just keep, they're referencing back. You get to reference back whenever I don't know, does it meet blah 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 principle? How does it fulfill this principle? So as we go around and discuss these, keep them in mind that's what they are there for. Is they're to guide decision making, to guide understanding, to guide your process about how you think and how you do. The TIY, do it yourself, or think it yourself, DIY. So who wants to step up first? All right, here we go.
Okay. Every function is supported by many elements. Planned redundancy will ensure that all important functions will be met despite the failure of one or more elements. Example, polycultural crops, diverse energy sources, and diverse livelihoods.
What do you think? Planned redundancy. Remember last night I said planning is best done in advance? And that's not explicit in one of these principles, but you should still write it down somewhere. It's a great phrase. What's the there's like a classic sort of little phrase sometimes that might encapsulate this notion of planned redundancy, like a little colloquialism. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. The financial people would say diversify your portfolio of investment, right? And so all this is basically saying is, don't, if you want to go all in on one bet, make or break, well, you might win the Darwin Award or not. It's gambling. If you would like to have systems that are resilient, it would be best to diversify, right? Systems that, by design, plan, that are redundant, that have feedbacks that are self-supporting. So if you lose this job, well, you still got that part-time, and you still got your some cash under the mattress, or on the financial, like how do you design a system that this concept of resilient, right? It's interdigitated. These digits, they come together and they're woven, they're knitted, they're held, the warp and the weft is held together, the fabric. And we want to design systems that have integrity to the fabric. And again, remember on the principles, we are talking about social systems, and we're talking about ecological systems, we're talking about all systems, so this is across the board. But does that make sense? This is one of our favorite, I'm not going to write down them all, but I'm going to grab up some of them. This one will force you to be honest, to the question of honesty, to be honest with the watershed, to be honest with the forest, to be honest with your community and your neighborhood. These are about honesty. Who's got another one? All right. It's Jane.
Jane, yeah.
Jane.
The problem is the solution. We are the problem, we are the solution. In permaculture, the focus is on turning constraints into resources.
What do you think?
Yeah.
Thought?
Human error.
It's a perceptual opportunity to some degree. It's back to scarcity and abundance. At some level, not to say that some folks may not be dealt a bad hand or something, but how do we wish to perceive, is the glass half empty, half full? There's just a philosophical way in which you individually or us collectively move in the world. And the problem is the solution is just a bumper sticker that tries to support. Take a step back when you're confronted with what feels like an intractable problem that's insolvable, and see if there's not a way to kind of get a different perception as reality, and say, well, there's actually an opportunity here if I just look at it differently. Can I work with it, and can we make hay while the sun shines? Right?
I like to observe that everything that I need is at hand. I just may not see it yet, so by studying it further, particularly if it is a restraint, eventually, in my experience, it sorts out so that I see that I have all the pieces.
And has that been effective for helping you move forward in your life?
Yeah.
Right? Kendall mentioned that we did a design project for a farm called Jug Handle Farm up in Mendocino County. And we had this big property and a bunch of stuff, and it was amazing, and ocean views and all these things, and they had a list of all the stuff they wanted. We want one of these in a building and an outdoor classroom and blah blah blah, and kitchens and what drove that design, or where you could put things in the design, was actually the constraints. Because the government said, well, that's a wetland, and from 50 feet out of this space, you don't get to do anything. Oh, and that's a view corridor, and you don't get to put anything here. And oh, that's a, right, and all of a sudden, and so by getting the, quote, constraints, however they're imposed, legally imposed, socially imposed, ecologically, hydrologically, whatever those things that are imposed on the site, by drawing boundaries on those, the opportunities to do what they wanted it wasn't like it was unlimited. The site's not unlimited, back to my use of the phrase limit. It's actually, there are limits. And it's better to figure out what, quote, constrains things, and then out of that emerges what opportunity remains, right? As a design principle, as a practice, as a mantra, as a meditation. These principles are meditations. Who's got another one? Sam.
Observation. Use protracted and thoughtful observation of natural systems rather than protracted and thoughtless labor. This one's really apt for me. Observation. Keep it simple. I went from conventional, normal horsemanship through a process which involved observation versus evaluation. The idea that a human can anthropomorphically objectify an animal for use versus what the animal really needs. And so that's the observation versus human speciesist evaluation.
Okay. I often invoke the opportunity to differentiate between, as designers, do you impose on the site, evaluate the animal, or do you compose with? So is your design impositional or compositional? Is it based in hubris, imposition, arrogance, or is it based in humility and working with in an observant and reciprocal way? And I think what we're striving for in permaculture is last night Bill talked about, we always aim to be developers when we were talking about crystal waters towards the end. As developers, whether it's your apartment, patio that Jeff's got, whatever scale, are we composing with or imposing upon, as just an ethical principle way of being in the world? And I think that the observation piece of that, and so we've encapsulated this one into this little acronym here: protracted and thoughtful observation. Pato. ¿Quién habla español? ¿Qué dice Pato? Duck, right? Because here's the deal, you can't duck the issue, baby, you gotta observe. Right, so it's about protracted thoughtful observation. So it becomes jargon in the Permi vernacular. And some people will say, I need to go pato the site, I need to go pato my life, I need to go pato my desk, clean it up and figure out how it works or something. Or I need to go do some protracted and thoughtful observation of whatever my design challenge is in that moment, at whatever scale. And this one is really important. It's the most important. I venture to guess the education that Kendall and I got at UC Santa Cruz in environmental studies and liberal arts type perspective of ecological worldview was ultimately, as a naturalist, is becoming trained observers. That's by far the skill set, I think, right, that we got is the notion of being a trained observer and paying attention. There is a statement I've heard that says, I'm so broke I can't afford to pay attention. Well, if you're that broke, well, you can't afford it.
You're broken.
You're broke, right? So, again, play with. So this becomes critical. And in fact, the first thing you should do, an observation there is actually up at the front. It's basically the first principle, and the font is a little bit bigger. I'm sometimes not even sure if it's a principle. It's almost like a meta. It's the glue, it's the verb that glues the ethics to the principles. It's the behavior. It's the yoga. It's the asana. This is the most important, if we were talking about yoga positions and things. Each of these principles are, in essence, kind of asanas, right? We're going to go through them. Each one is stretching a different part, or doing strengthening a different part. This one is kind of the meta, observation is the meta yoga, or maybe it's the breath work, I don't know, it's the pranayama or something. I'm trying to remember it, but
Mindfulness.
Flag on the
Right,
play.
it's just
Too many
exactly.
metaphors.
right, being really mindful. Which means you get to be mindful on the Zafu, but you also get to be mindful on the street, in the woods, out, in the neighborhood, at school. All right, who's got another one? Yeah.
Every element supports many functions. How many functions can we get from every element? We include in our plans. Choose each element in a system and place it so that it performs as many functions as possible. Example, a pond provides cooling, supports ducks, fish, and aquatic plants, thus creating a richer habitat. It also catches rainfall, which can be used for irrigation, fire protection, or domestic household water. The clay dug from the pond can be used for building structures such as buildings, walls, benches, ovens, and plaster finishes. A berry hedge serves as food, fence, wildlife, and domestic animal forage, as well as pollen for bees to make honey.
Pretty straightforward, huh?
Yeah.
Again, if you're at a cocktail party and you hear somebody saying stacking functions, you can pretty much be guaranteed they have been inculcated into the permacult. Inculcated.
Is that not a real word?
It's not a good word, it is a real word.
Yeah.
Anybody want to take a stab at inculcation? Yeah.
Teach by repetition.
Sure. That methodology will yield somebody being in a state of inculcation on the subject, right?
Penetrating.
Just being deeply steeped, having been brought into, in whatever, ensconced. So the fun part is this idea of stacking functions. And there's two words in there that we're getting through, and planned redundancy. These two are kind of, if you notice, if you read them back and forth, one leads with every element supports many functions, and the other one talks about every function supported by many elements. And so what there is happening here is an element and a function. If we were talking about language, I would venture to guess what you're basically talking about is nouns and verbs, right? You're talking about things and flows. products